everybody. Thank you very much indeed for coming. I'd like to begin with greeting you in the Arabic greeting. Assalamu alaikum. May peace be upon you. My name is Dr. Saad Ali. I am founding chair of the Council for Arabic and Islamic Studies. I am associate professor of Arabic literature, Middle Eastern and Islamic Studies, director of the Arabic Studies program at the School of International Letters and Cultures. On behalf of the Council and our Arabic Studies program, it is my distinct pleasure to welcome you all to our spring keynote lecture on understanding Islam, Arabs, Islamophobia, and terrorism. That will be presented shortly by the world-renowned and leading scholar, Dr. John Esposito, to whom we extend a warm welcome, and his wife, Dr. Jeanette Esposito. Allow me also please to welcome Dr. Rebecca Sosi, Vice Provost of Inclusion and Community Outreach, Dr. George Justice, Dean of the Humanities in the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, and many of our respected colleagues and students and community leaders and community. And I have some of my colleagues who were on the front seats who are not here yet, and we will welcome them when they're here. We would like to welcome you to our lecture of the Council for Arabic Islamic Studies that was established at Arizona State University to acknowledge the significant contributions of Arabic studies and Islamic civilization and cultures to the world at large, both historically and in the modern age. The Council's research and interdisciplinary teaching programs seek to promote multiculturalism, diversity, interfaith dialogue, cross-cultural understanding, and the expansion of human civilization and cultures through Arabic as well as other Middle Eastern languages, including Persian and Turkish. The Council seeks to develop constructive academic and cultural interaction and partnerships between ASU and similar groups in the Arab and Muslim world, as well as nationally. It has always been my conviction that literature is often conceived as a cultural tool towards greater human understanding. The more we study others' literary arts, cultures, and civilizations, the better enabled we become to achieve understanding and to work toward world peace, hopefully. I'd like, at this point, to thank all those who have been working and our sponsors that I'm going to mention them at the end after the lecture and the discussion. But at this point, I'd like to introduce Dr. John Esposito, University Professor of Religion and International Affairs and of Islamic Studies at Georgetown University. John Esposito is founding director of the Alwaleed Center for Muslim-Christian Understanding in the Welsh School of Foreign Service. Previously, he was a Loyola Professor of Middle Eastern Studies, College of the Holy Cross. Past president of the American Academy of Religion and Middle Eastern Studies Association of North America, Dr. Esposito has served as consultant to the U.S. Department of State and other agencies, European and Asian governments, corporations, universities, and media worldwide, an ambassador for the United Nations Alliance of Civilizations, and was a member of the World Economic Forum's Council of 100 Leaders and EC European Network of Experts of De-Radicalization. He has received honorary doctorates from St. Michael's College, University of Toronto, the University of Sarajevo, the University of Florida, and so many others, as well as several awards. Dr. Esposito's more than 45 books include The Future of Islam, Islamophobia, and the Challenge of Pluralism in the 21st Century, Who Speaks for Islam, What a Billion Muslims Really Think, Unholy War, Terror in the Name of Islam, The Islamic Threat, Myth or Reality, Islam and Politics, Makers of Contemporary Islam, and Islam and Democracy, and many other books. He was editor-in-chief, the Oxford University Studies Online and Series editor of the Oxford Library of Islamic Studies. He served as editor-in-chief of the Oxford Encyclopedia of Islam, of Islamic World, about 6 volumes, the Oxford Encyclopedia of the Modern Islamic World, 4 volumes, the Oxford History of Islam, the Oxford Dictionary of Islam, and the Islamic World, past and present, 3 volumes. Editors, Professor Esposito's interviews and articles with newspapers include magazines and media in the US, Europe, Asia, and the Middle East, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Economist, the Guardian, the Times of London, CNN, ABC, Nightline, CBS, NBC, and the BBC. A native of Brooklyn, New York, he currently resides in Washington, D.C. with his wife, Dr. Jeanette Esposito, and she is here. We welcome them both warmly. I'd like you please to join me to welcoming them to Arizona State University.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. I enjoyed that introduction much more than I'm going to enjoy the talk, or that you're going to enjoy the talk. But in any case, thank you very much for all the work that you did, Professor Ali, to bring me here. And my game plan tonight is to provide a context for us to have, hopefully, a discussion. In a sense, I could say, why are we here? Well, Islamophobia has grown exponentially in the last year, far more than since 9/11. And there's good reason for that concern. Also, negative media coverage has grown far more in the last year. And if one watches the presidential debates and listens to Mr. Carson and Mr. Trump, and at times Mr. Cruz and Mr. Rubio, those are probably the most polite ways that I could refer to them in terms of some of the things that they say, but I don't want to go into their politics, just the way in which they handle issues like immigration and Muslims and people who are of color, etc. One can see reasons, but let's really be very upfront and frank about it. Domestic and international terrorist attacks, like Paris, like San Bernardino, the visibility and role of Al-Qaeda and ISIL, but also, often missed, mass and social media, that is mass media and social media, and American presidential elections, and I'll talk about that. The uptick in Islamophobia tends to occur, for example, in 2008, 2010, 2012, the presidential and congressional elections, and we see it also now in the debates. As a result, fear of Islam and Muslims, not just of militant extremists, but fear of the religion of Islam and the vast majority of Muslims who are brushstroked by those actions, has now become normalized in popular culture in America and Europe. According to the Public Religion Research Institute, no religious, social, racial, or ethnic group has been perceived as facing greater discrimination in the US than Muslims. This in turn has had a significant impact on domestic policies, the civil liberties of Muslims, influenced the radicalization of some Muslims in Europe and America, and informed Western foreign policies, from invasion and occupation to drone attacks, which continue today, and the US and EU responses to the Arab Spring and the Arab Winter, and the increased support by the United States and Europe of authoritarian regimes rather than support for democratization. Now, having said all of this, let me say that if this were 30 or 40 years ago, there would be no audience, there would be no topic. When I got into the field well, let's just say when I got into the field quite a few decades ago, there was no interest in Islam or Muslims. I had been in a monastery for 10 years, then became a Vatican II young Catholic theologian, teaching theology in a Catholic college. And when I said I was going to study Islam, all of my colleagues said, "You'll never get a job," because the idea was Catholic institutions will always have theology departments. What is Islam about? As my colleagues said, and these were educated people, why are you going into that abracadabra field? To talk about Islam was to be equated with Arabs. To talk about Arabs was visions of Bedouin, deserts, harems, etc. Today we exchange that image with the image of terrorists and Kalashnikovs. So that was the approach. When I finished my degree, they were indeed right. There were no jobs. The only reason I got a job was that I had graduate degrees in Christianity. I majored in Islam, and you had to minor in 2 religions. I minored in Hinduism and Zen Buddhism. But as for Islam and Muslims, that was invisible. What put Islam on the map was the Iranian Revolution. But what that meant was that for most Americans, as indeed for most Europeans, their engagement with Islam and Muslims came through the lens of a revolution which took Americans hostages, and which for many Americans meant the engagement was looking at your TV and seeing people shout death to America. Well, you don't have to be intelligent to say there are people that don't like us. But when it was seen as a global threat, that is when Ayatollah Khomeini talked about and called upon other Islamic revolutions in the Gulf, and in a sense, getting beyond that, that became the way in which things were seen. Now, let me give you an idea of what it meant in those days. In those days, Muslims were invisible in the American landscape. Yes, there were Muslims here, but they didn't stand out. If people saw somebody who was a Muslim, they'd identify them as, let's say, a Kuwaiti if they knew them, or an Egyptian or an Iranian. They'd say, who are you? Just the way somebody would say, I'm Italian-American, you know, or I'm Polish-American, or just, you know, I'm American. Many would just be identified by their ethnic background. Post-Iran, more and more you had situations where Arabs were denounced or stopped on buses because people had a problem with Iranians. And that continued for many years. 9/11 really put it over the top in terms of simply taking a whole group of people and lumping them together under the word Muslim. I happened to be in Australia doing a series of lectures, and I spoke with a young woman. Well, she wasn't young at this time. Well, she was relatively young. Relative to my age, everybody's young. But anyway. But she was probably in her 40s, had come there as a young Greek girl and was now a member of the parliament. And she noted that before 9/11, people who came from various parts of the Muslim world were seen in terms of their ethnic background, just as she was seen as Greek. After 9/11, everybody got lumped together. Okay? To give you an idea of the situation, in those days you had the Today Show, and every day the Today Show would have coverage of the hostages, the hostage taking. So they'd have somebody at the gate waiting to hear the spokesperson, whose name was Miriam, talk about what the condition of the hostages were like. Well, one morning, Tom Brokaw, who happened to be the person who was the main person running the program, interrupted the broadcast to say, let me tell you about the religion of Islam. Islam is the second largest of the world's religions. It has a prophet named Muhammad, and it has a sacred book called the Quran. That indicated how much he thought your average American viewer knew about Islam and Muslims. That is nothing. And what he told them was still next to nothing. And this is in an America where we see ourselves as one of the most educated countries in the world. Until the latest debates, but I don't want to go down that road again. I just sit there and I want to correct them for their language, their syntax, their civility, etc. But in any case, anybody at that time who had been traveling overseas, your average American, who had been traveling overseas, would be stunned if they went to any country and somebody said that they had never heard the word Jesus, Moses, Bible, Jew, or Christian. I mean, in other words, they would feel that's part of the kind of vocabulary. I knew as a young academic I ran into it. I'd be in a context and I'd say something like to a colleague who might be a scholar of Romance languages, and they'd say, how was your trip to Lebanon? I'd say, I came back from Pakistan. He'd say, Lebanon, Pakistan, they're all the same. I began teaching courses in Islam, Zen Buddhism, mysticism. So a colleague of mine who was a very well-educated Jesuit priest I mean, really and a great consultant in the United States. One day, well, I had a kid, and I told him to take your course on Islam this semester. I said, I'm teaching Zen Buddhism. He said, Islam, Zen Buddhism, what's the difference? I mean, you know, that sort of generic sense. Because also, we were a predominantly Christian nation. Then we came to see ourselves, but Christian meant white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. 60s and 70s, there was a book that got a lot of attention because it talked about American religion, and it was Protestant Catholics, so the Catholics made it in, and Jews who had made it in just a little bit before us in terms of being recognized. But that was the nation. All other religions were grouped under what was called world religions, even though the first three are world religions. Under world religions, you had Confucianism, Hinduism, Buddhism, and Islam. Totally different religions. So what attracted me to Islam, among other things, was to suddenly take a course in which we all had to take a course in world religions, no matter what we majored in, and discover that there was this religion called Islam. It had nothing to do with Hinduism and Buddhism, and it clearly had links to Judaism and Christianity. You know, I mean, just as if you were a Christian and you really didn't know much about Judaism, you were semi-illiterate, or your parents just didn't, they raised you but didn't really educate you. If you began to, you know, read the Bible, you would begin to see the connections there. So that's where we were in a context, and therefore, for the average American to now engage that new religion and to see these people, then that represented everything. The other example I'll give, I haven't given in years, but she's here tonight, so she, the woman, meaning my wife, capitals. In our time, we lived in cities, for example, in New York, where I was raised, in Brooklyn, where you had ethnic neighborhoods. You had an Italian neighborhood, you had an Irish neighborhood, you had a Polish area, a Jewish area. So we had that sense. But it didn't mean in cosmopolitan New York that people really knew a lot about each other or necessarily respected them. Remember, tolerance doesn't mean I like you. Doesn't mean I want to have lunch with you. Tolerance means I accept your existence. I may not want to work with you. I may not want my daughter to marry you. I may not want to, you know, have lunch with you, etc. Okay? So we had these ethnic, you know, kinds of neighborhoods. What that meant was that when people met a new ethnic group, it was very easy to generalize about them. My grandmother would warn me about the Irish, because in that time, a mixed marriage was an Italian marrying a non-Italian. It wasn't across religions. And well, I had an Aunt Kitty who was Irish. Now, there was a problem. Uncle George, like a lot of people, liked to drink. Aunt Kitty liked to drink, but the difference was Uncle George was a man. Aunt Kitty would drink beer and get high, and my grandmother would say, in effect, that's what they're all like. And in fact, in the area that I was raised, depending on how you saw it, it was that Irish people really liked to drink. Now, it didn't mean that Italians didn't like to drink, but of course, we're the superior culture and race, so anything we did was fine. We're a people of opera, the finer things of life, not the mafia. We all know the mafia actually belongs to another group that will go unnamed. Somehow we Italians got blamed for that. But in my case, I date this woman and I bring her home, the woman, to meet my mother and father. And my wife comes out and she's got virtually no makeup on. She's wearing an all-black dress with no color, you know, looking kind of somewhat severe. And after it, she had a great time with my parents. But it turned out that the only Italian she knew was a couple next door, and they tended to be loud, shouted, fought a lot. I explained to her they were probably Irish, and she just thought that they were Italian. But we tended to generalize, let alone with religions. We had 2 Jews that lived in my neighborhood, and the generalizations were like, you know, beyond belief, because we really didn't know what Jews were like. We'd believe almost anything that was said. Now you can imagine for people, for a culture that's never met this other religion, okay, and in fact would say things like, those Islams, you know what I mean? Or like they're all the same, or ask them about the desert when people were coming from urban areas, you know. When you then see an Iranian revolution and you think that that is representative, you know, you don't have any sense of what's going on. Now, you then move, to get into what I want to do, you move down to 9/11, and you have the trauma of 9/11. But, you know, what does that really wind up and what does it mean? Think about it against this context. I'm going to read you something quickly. For the general public in America and Europe today, Islam is news of a particularly unpleasant sort. The media, the government, geopolitical strategists, and although they are marginal to the culture at large, academic experts, I love that phrase, it has been made by an academic too. Academic experts on Islam are all in concert. Islam is a threat to Western civilization. Now, this is by no means the same as saying that only derogatory or racist caricatures of Islam are to be found in the West. What I am saying, what I am saying is that negative images of Islam are very much more prevalent than any others, and that such images correspond not with what Islam is, but to what prominent sectors of a particular society take it to be. Islam in the West, clash of civilizations. Those sectors have the power and the will to propagate that particular image of Islam, and this image, therefore, becomes the more prevalent, more present than all others. Guess when that was said? 1981, long before 9/11, by a professor at Columbia University, 1981. But it was right after the Iranian Revolution. And right after the Iranian Revolution, within a couple of years, suddenly you had major newspapers in Europe and America talking about, and political analysts talking about a triple threat. This religion of Islam, not just the Iranians, that is Iran, not Iranians all over, but Iran, but Islam was a triple threat. It was a triple threat politically, civilizationally, and demographically, i.e., the West, which had not been aware of Muslims or Islam existing in it, Europe and America, suddenly found a significant number of Muslims. And today, Islam is the second or third largest religion in Europe and America. 40 years ago, that wasn't the case. So in the 1990s, you see this notion of a triple threat. Now, when 9/11 comes along, now we have the real threat. Now, it's kind of a little difficult, and I say this with a certain amount of respect, but if you really want to think about what a trauma it was for us, okay? 3,000 people being killed is an absolute tragedy. And in fact, it was a little bit less, but it's an absolute tragedy, 3,000 people, okay? But think about Hiroshima, Nagasaki. Think about the kinds of things we've seen since then all over the world. You know, think about, if you actually add up, and I'll refer to it later on, the number of people killed in the United States. Not just murdered, but I'll refer to by extremist groups. There were something like 337 events take place every year, the vast majority by white anti-government groups, okay, that don't get a lot of attention. But for us, 3,000 people, we'd never had a domestic attack. And also the terrorists were, yeah, they were bastards. Oh, this is being videotaped. That's okay. I use that in a lot of lectures, so it can get worse, so just let's relax, okay? And I usually do it even more when my wife's here because she's already doing it. Look at me like I'm a little boy who's being corrected. That quizzical look like, are you really going to say that? Okay. But think about what happened to us. It was also the symbolism of it. The terrorists wind up attacking Wall Street and Washington. I mean, there was symbolism there, you know? They didn't attack Idaho, you know, or, you know what I mean? Or Wells Fargo in Idaho. It would have been terrible if people got killed there, you know, even if they had knocked out a good part of the city, but it wouldn't have had, I mean, that's why they were able to affect the economy the way they did. They were able to put such fear, because for people, it was, if New York and Washington can get hit, then every city, every place. And then we know what happened. Politicians found it convenient whenever there was an election. Karl Rove was known, you don't have to believe me, you go on the internet, you read major newspapers, when he would advise President Bush when he would go to run, and indeed politicians knew, playing the fear threat, you had to show your muscle. And if you were a president, I'm sorry, somebody running for president, you were never in the military, you had to show your muscle even more. And when you then became a president, if you were never in the military, you had to show your muscle. You always had to be talking about, to protect yourself when you were going to go into elections, that it was going to be security. Even if we went through a period when there were no other really great attacks, you always had to be, you were vulnerable to somebody saying, you know, you were not protecting America. Okay. Post 9/11 is when you then see this tremendous growth in those early years in mass media and then in social media, of not simply an analysis and a criticism of violent terrorists, but indeed of the religion of Islam and Muslims. Because people began to say it's not just extremists that are a problem, it's their religion. So, for example, we have an abortion clinic bombing by a Christian group, even a minister. We've had that kind of thing take place. We have the Ku Klux Klan, historically. Okay, used Christian symbols, saw themselves derivatively as somehow, you know, this kind of like white Christian pristine group. We see Jewish extremists go into the Hebron Mosque and slaughter people. And we also see Muslim extremists, but I'm using the example for a reason. When we see the Jews and the Christians doing that, okay, even I think for some, if they see the attacks that take place by Hindu extremists in India, they don't say it's the religion. You know, our gut is not to say that's the way all Jews are. That's the way all Catholics are. That's the way all even when we looked at Northern Ireland, you know, we saw the troubles. We saw Protestants and Catholics going at each other. We saw the leader of the Protestants using religious language, referring to, you know, the Pope in Catholicism as, you know, the whore, Babylon, you know, etc. But nobody said that's what all Protestants are like. I mean, people in America didn't say, well, we got to worry about Protestants. We got to worry about, you know, all Catholics, okay? So in that context, you begin to then see, though, this indiscriminate, where you begin to see headlines that are not just saying that there's a clash of civilizations. It's a broad notion of a clash of civilizations. Not a clash between extremists and non-extremists, but it's like a clash between Islam and the West. You know, whatever the West is. I mean, it's ironic. We don't say between even, so you've got a massive cultural phrase, the West, and then you use the religion. You know, it would be different if you said between Muslim extremists and whatever, or between some Muslim countries and whatever. Now, it's interesting because how many of you have ever heard the name Sam Huntington? Okay, the Clash of Civilizations. Well, Sam, in his article in his book, when he talks about the Clash of Civilizations, he doesn't say Muslim countries have bloody borders. Many of them do. He used the phrase, Islam has bloody borders. You see? Language matters. And I know I debated him after he did his book. I also debated him after his article, but I did a TV show and asked him when he did the book, why didn't he change it to Muslim countries? And he just wouldn't answer. You know, it was Islam has, you know. Now, you know, you could say, well, there are certain passages in the Quran, and I can answer that later, but all I'd say to you is, have you ever read the Bible? Far more passages that deal with violence and terror in the Old Testament, for example. Okay? And in some sections of the Old Testament, you're talking about genocide. Kill all the women, children, animals, you know, et cetera, et cetera. But we know how to contextualize and put that in a context. We don't say, well, that's those people's book, because for many of us, that's our book. You know, so we know how to contextualize that, and we do the same thing, you know, with regard to Christianity. I mean, a lot of Christians like to just say, look at the New Testament. When it's convenient, they go to the Old Testament. But all you have to do is go to Christian history after the 3rd century, and then you've got the Inquisition, you've got the Crusades, etc. But we always see the bad stuff is when people have gone astray. You know, I mean, there's always that way of playing it out. That doesn't happen in terms of the media. Now, let me give you an idea of what this means. I would argue that far-right political activists, parties, media, hardline Christian Zionists, I don't mean just Christian Zionists, hardline Christian Zionists means militant Christian Zionists, who would support, at times, acts of repression, etc., okay? And religious leaders, certain religious leaders, who I call preachers of hate, and that cuts across a number of religions, okay, assert with impunity what they could never say about another religion in our press. They could never say about Catholics, Protestants, or Jews. They couldn't say about African Americans or about certain ethnic groups. They wouldn't dare say it about Italians. They wouldn't dare say it about Irish, because we're all mainstream now, you know. Or they wouldn't say it about white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, you know, etc. We're at a point where we can say that, and it can just, I mean, all you have to do is watch sometimes TV or read a newspaper and substitute for Islam and Muslims, put another religion. And I've done that. In fact, when it's really good, I should have done it tonight, is when you put a religion's name in and you don't tell the audience why you're doing it. Because then you can see the look in the eyes of people who belong to that religion and are really ticked off. You know what I mean? Where you're saying, well, this is what they do, you know, this is what, you know. And for Catholics, it was always, this isn't Holy Mother of the Church. You know. Parenthetically, it's interesting if you look at what won the Academy Award last night, right? Spotlight. You remember the talk that DiCaprio gave, where he talked about, not DiCaprio, it was a Spotlight one. I don't think it was Leon DiCaprio. Who was it? In Spotlight, when they accepted it and they called upon Pope Francis and the Catholic Church to react more strongly, right? And some of you didn't see, but this morning Cardinal Pell, based in the Vatican, said it was scandalous what happened in the cover-up. So it shows you how a movie and media can have an impact. But for mainstream Catholics, it would be, that's horrendous, and these people need to be really prosecuted. But they wouldn't see that as going at the heart of their faith. So I want to emphasize that as I get into now the question of the image of Islam and Muslims. So I talked about in Iran and how that became the lens through which one would see it. Now let me show you how mass media becomes a major lens. I want to make sure I can move around, right? Like this. This is no problem. Okay. I'm okay. Okay, good. It's better if I stay by this microphone. Okay. All right. Okay. Good. All right. Good. I don't think well if I don't move around. Okay. All right. Let me tell you about this. Here's a study done by one outfit. It's called Media, M-E-D-I-A, because I know undergraduates can't spell. Tenor, T-E-N-O-R. And you can go up on the internet and look around for this. This is an outfit based in Europe that's, great, thank you. Okay, like karaoke, this is terrific. I used to sing We Marie in Italian as a child. I may do it at the end, because whenever I did it, I never got any applause. All right, Media Tenor studied media from 2001 to 2011. 975,000 pieces from major newspapers. 975,000 pieces, 2001, 2011. And they looked at, okay, here you got all this coverage. Within all of this coverage, 975,000 pieces, let's see how much of it deals with Islam and Muslims. They found that 2% dealt with Muslim extremism, militant extremists. 0.1% dealt with the vast majority of ordinary Muslims, Muslim countries, cultures, okay? So 2%, 0.1%, okay? 2011, the 2%, somewhat understandably, jumps up to 25%. 2% to 25%. And on this side, 0.1%. No movement at all. Now, think about now the even greater disparity when that goes to 25% to that side, okay? What that really shows is this incredible overlap where, again, for the average American, who may be particularly the older American, who when they went to school, just like military, government people, you know, when I finished my degree, nobody was interested in inviting me to a university. I never spoke to the military. After 9/11, my career took off. I owe my career, my first Lexus, to the Ayatollah Khomeini. It's a reality. I moved from a Toyota Camry like that, okay? But, I mean, this reality then, for your average, if it's an older person who didn't engage, you know, in school, and even today, more than 50% of Americans say they don't know a Muslim. So you don't know a Muslim, you never met a Muslim. More than 50% say, I don't know much about Islam, I really should. And 55%, when asked about Islam and Muslims, say nothing or I don't know. Okay? In that context then, and this is the mass media, they're getting it from mass media. You know, they're getting it from newspapers, they're getting it from TV, okay? Now, let's ratchet that up and look at a more recent study, and then I'll get to social media. A Media Tenor report in 2015 basically says things have gotten much worse. 80% of the media coverage that they studied was negative. And to give you an example, media coverage in the US, UK, and Germany, those three countries, 9 out of 10 stories, articles were negative, 9 out of 10. Even the stories about mainstream Muslims, more than 50% lean towards the negative. When they featured personalities, when you look, only 5% of the coverage dealt with individuals. When they did, they were overwhelmingly warlords and so-called jihadists. Because, why? Because for media, as for all of what we do, it's the bottom line. And for media, if it bleeds, it leads. Now, this isn't just a phrase that I made up. You talk to media people. We ran a big conference on media, and we had the editor-in-chief of Newsweek. We had the Washington Post. The editor-in-chief of Newsweek at that time was a guy with a PhD, won 2 Pulitzer Prizes for writing about people like Jefferson. So he was an intellectual, but also an editor. When he was asked by some Muslims in the audience, why don't you cover more mainstream? He said, you know, I have to be honest. He said, what sells is conflict and conflict discourse. Put your TV on at night. In any city, first thing that leads off is local murders, then international murders, you know, and then if things are slow, there's a train wreck in Japan. I mean, you know, it's a reality. And then at the end, they always have that one story, you know, about the little kid who got saved, and somebody told me lately about another channel and was so happy about it because he said, oh, they always have 2 stories at the end. But if you notice, most of the stories that they do anyway are like 15 seconds. So my point is, you've got this level of negativity, and today you've got that 80%. So much so that today only 27% of Americans have a favorable attitude towards Islam and Muslims. 27%. Now, let me give you just a little bit to back that up a little bit more. But let me say something about social media, and then at the end, I'll get to that. Yeah, they probably didn't tell you. Probably in about an hour, they will be serving dinner here whenever I speak. If it's in the morning, we have breakfast. There'll be little bags of food, sandwich, etc. So you can just sit back now, take your shoes off, and get comfortable. Okay. You get to a certain point in life where the only person you like listening to is yourself. So it's a bad night for you. Okay. Let's look at social media. In the old days, 10, 15 years ago, social media was driven by mass media. In other words, if there was a major story covered by CBS, the major, then people would start Facebook, tweeting, etc. Okay. Now it's just the reverse. If it goes viral, because that's the great thing about social media, you put an article out there. I mean, if I write a piece, let's say for the New York Times, number one, you write for the New York Times, unless you have some sort of real entree, I mean absolute luck, and you're not supposed to have that luck, the New York Times will say, we get so much, we'll let you know in a few days. By the time they let you know, it's a dead story, okay? You get on the internet and it goes viral, you have far more coverage. Even if you put it gets in the New York Times, you have far smaller readership of the New York Times, okay? So with social media has boomeranged, and what that means is that social media has a disproportionate impact. I was involved in giving a talk in Dallas, and it got picked up on social media. Somebody with a big following sent out and basically said, there's going to be this dinner. It's a fundraiser for a Muslim community outside of Dallas, and I'm calling upon my followers across the United States to demonstrate there against these Muslims. So now we had people come. It was Pam Geller who was behind a lot of the problems when Park 51, etc. She called upon her people. You had people on Facebook and Twitter saying, I've got a collection of guns. They're loaded, and when I come back, they won't be loaded. And then the guy said, is anybody bringing dynamite? By the time we had the program, we had police, SWAT teams, helicopters, you name it. It's an incredible experience. On the other hand, you can feel like you're somewhat important at that point. It's not like you just show up today quietly, you walk up the stairs, people don't know who you are, the kid wants to stop you, If like you go do an event sometimes and people want to stop me when I'm the speaker and say, wait a minute, we got to give you a card, are you going to get in? Suddenly you get all this at the personal bodyguards, but that's what somebody was able to do on the internet. And why? Once she did that and it caught on, then Ed O'Reilly put it on. In the old days, it was when Ed O'Reilly did it that got picked up the other way. So you've got that kind of impact. Now, what does that really mean? You've got a lot of bloggers and you've got a lot of websites, okay, that are easily identified as criticizing Islam and Muslims. So you've got Jihad Watch or Answering Islam, etc. But you also have a lot of websites like Pajama Media, family security, American thinker. You want to look at American thinker. It's a good sign of the failure of American education. I mean, when I first thought of it, I thought American thinker, this could probably have some interesting articles. They tend to be very far right, very anti-immigrant, and have a real problem with Muslims. But they tend to cross-fertilize each other. Now, why are they so significant and why do they have an impact? 2 studies based on IRS returns. So these studies are not studies where you can say, well, these are claims about how much money gets pumped and how much they have. It's all based on IRS returns. One was done by the Center for American Progress and found that over a 10-year period, 6 major philanthropies had donated $42.5 million to these folks. Not that they necessarily, all of them, knew how bad these folks were, because these were major philanthropies that would give them money and then other people would distribute it to other people, okay? Another outfit, CARE, did a study, a 3-year study, and found $119 million. So you're talking about a very well-funded machine. You know, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. Remember, these are just 2 studies. Okay? And remember, also, when I use this word Islamophobia, the first time that word was used in America was at the time of the so-called mosque at Ground Zero, Park 51. What we call Islamophobia, which is anti-Islam and anti-Muslim, it doesn't mean criticizing Muslim militants. It doesn't mean criticizing empirically the religion of Islam, that you see something that you don't like, you don't understand, or criticizing some Muslims. It means discrimination. It means bias. It means hate speech. It means hate crimes, okay? That word was never used in America until the Park 51. Time magazine was the first major publication to have on its cover the question, is America Islamophobic? And it answered the question in the affirmative. It was a very good article that was done. But that was the first time. We just had no sense that that phenomenon existed. You know, we just had no sense of it. Just as we've had no sense until the latest FBI report that the #1 threat in terms of terrorist threat comes from white anti-government organizations. And from other organizations have also done those studies. Okay, so as a result of this kind of coverage, what does that lead to? It leads to a situation where in the American elections in 2000 and 2012, you had Colin Powell saying, so what if President Obama were a Muslim? He's not, but so what? Because of the way it was cast. 2008 and 2012, you remember, religion was very much out there. Is the president a Muslim? The birther question, which Mr. Trump and others brought forth. You had many candidates talking about Islam and Muslims directly. One candidate suggesting maybe we ought to wiretap all the mosques in America. Not maybe we operate the way we do in American law. If we think there's a problem with a church or a mosque or people that are there, then you get a subpoena and you go monitor, but rather a blanket monitor. Maybe we should have special ID cards. Maybe we should have special regulations, not only profiling, but special regulations, special limitations on people. Okay, all of that started to come in during that period. Okay. More recently, we have Mr. Trump saying that we should keep all Muslims out for the time being. We have Mr. Trump saying maybe we should shut down mosques. We have Mr. Trump saying that maybe a technique we should use with the terrorists is, and he got into a whole thing about shooting with bullets and talked about General Pershing. If you wanted a Q&A, I'll answer that. But in order to make it even more appealing to people, he said, we'll dip the bullets in pig's blood, knowing that Muslims like Jews don't eat pig, and then we'll dip it in, and then we'll tell them we're going to shoot those kinds of bullets into them to set a tone. And I think the story went something like that General Pershing took 50 people, had 49 executed. The 50th guy thought he was going to be executed. The gun did not fire bullets, and then the idea was, look at what happened to the other 49. Now go back and tell your people what we're going to do to you. So that's the way we're going to solve. Mr. Carson said that, in fact, a Muslim would have to disassociate himself from his faith and his beliefs in order to be able to become president. When it was pointed out that that goes against the Constitution, he kept silent. Now, here's the interesting thing. you had articles talking about how his own advisors had just been saying to him, you know, you're coming down too hard, watch your statements, right? So he makes this statement, the advisors go, oh my God, and the next day what happened? The donations went up and the percentages went up. The same thing was true for Mr. Trump. So it gives you a sense of the influence that media can have and what people, and particularly when you're in the sensitive time of elections. Now, what does that impact really then lead to? You know, what are the actual sort of facts that we have? Who are Muslims? Who are American Muslims? The hard data that we have from the Gallup organization, from Pew. It runs completely against the image that you hear. Educationally, for Muslims, Muslims are second to American Jews in terms of religious communities in America, in terms of education. Second to American Jews. 40% have college degrees versus 29%. 40% versus 29% of Americans overall. Muslim women are as educated and as professionally placed as Muslim men. Very different than many Muslim countries. Okay? Socioeconomically, they span the economic spectrum. They are entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley. They are doctors, lawyers, engineers, educators. Doctor, lawyer, engineers, definitely there. How many Muslims in the audience? Raise your hand, please. Okay. I could question them, and most of them would tell you that for a good Muslim parent, doctor 1, lawyer 2, engineer 3. Nothing after that. And as I like to put it, if they're devout and you say, Mom, I'm going to drop out of medical school to do Islamic studies, your parents go bananas and say, if they're Arab, well, lucky, we can get you an imam, he'll teach you Islam, but go to medical school. In other words, get a job, get a life, okay? And we've had examples of that historically. But they are also educators, they are cab drivers, they are blue-collar people, they are small business owners. 40%, I think, of Muslims are small business, are business owners. 70% report that they have a job compared to 64% of Americans overall. Among non-working, 31% of full-time students compared to 10% of our general population. 31% compared to 10%. How about religion? In contrast to some Muslim countries, they are very pluralistic. What does that mean? 77% of Muslims said they worship the same God as Christians and Jews. 84% strongly emphasize shared values with Christians and Jews. Yet Muslims, 48%, are twice as likely to say that they or members of their family or friends have been discriminated against, profiled, etc., whatever their profile. I love this profile. I gotta keep this thing moving, but it was a great story after 9/11. First of all, you'd hear the story about two guys get on. They might actually come from an Arab country or be living here. They might have a beard, and they start talking Arabic. So you had this one thing where these two guys were actually discussing American football. They were Americans, but they fell into Arabic, and that got reported to the people, right? Okay. Well, that's because they're the hoi polloi, right, back in economy, okay? But you get a guy who gets on a plane. He's a doctor, ex-military, in first class. And they not only question him, they pull him off, and they really grill him. American citizen, ex-military, and a physician. And the response is, well, first class is even closer to the cockpit. So, and he had been in the country for 20 years. I mean, these situations are, pretty remarkable when they get out of hand. But anyway, that's just okay. Now, how about, excuse me, how about the side of where do Muslims fit in the mainstream with regard to intolerance and violence? Muslims hold mainstream views in the following way. Majority of Muslims believe other faiths can lead to eternal life. Only 64% of Christians believe that. Okay? And probably among the 64%, some of us are still wondering, but we've become progressive. You know, we're not sure. We know we're going to get there, so we'll open that door just a little, okay? All right. Muslims are almost as likely to prioritize their American identity over their religious identity. And many will say, I'm an American Muslim.
to kind of signal that, you see. I'm an American Muslim. I say I'm an Italian American. So it's interesting, but I started to reflect on that. Okay, in contrast, 93% have close non-Muslim friends, okay? Let me say that again. 93% have close non-Muslim friends. In contrast, most Americans, 75% of white Americans, report that 91% of their friends are white. 91% of their friends are white. 75% of white Americans report that 91% of their friends are white. They have one black friend, one Latino friend, I mean, this is the way it breaks. In other words, they have small numbers of other people. So you've got this, you know, this situation, okay? How about the issue of intolerance? Muslims score higher than most other believers in Gallup's Religious Tolerance Index. Asked whether targeting and killing civilians by the military can be justified, only Muslims opposed it. Protestants, Jews, Catholics believe it can be justified. Okay. On the other hand, how do Americans, in light of that reality, many Americans still talk about Muslims? 55%, what do you admire? Nothing, or I don't know. Majority say they don't know a Muslim. 33% disclose that they believe that Muslim Americans are more sympathetic to terrorists. 60% of those polled have negative feelings about Muslims. Nearly a quarter of Americans wouldn't want a Muslim as a neighbor. Okay, where are we today and where are we going? Where we are going is that, first of all, we have to begin to get a fix on the realities. Let's start with the domestic scene. A fraction of a fraction of a fraction of American Muslims have engaged in or committed an act of terrorism. That's not me saying it. You go on the internet, you look at the FBI reports, you look at whatever reports you want to look at. Okay. You will see lots of people who've been arrested, for example, over the years. Most of them have been let out. Okay. But we do have major civil liberties issues. On the other hand, if you look at the problem that we have in terms of homegrown, domestic, white extremists, it's quite shocking. For example, for 13 and a half years after 9/11, there were 20 plots that were carried out by Muslim militants and accounted for 50 fatalities, okay? 20 plots, 50 fatalities. In contrast, white-wing extremists averaged 337 attacks per year in the decade after 9/11, causing a total of 254 fatalities.
Now, this isn't the heart of the question. It's not about the numbers. It's a matter of getting a sense of the extent of the threat. On the other hand, and this is the more provocative part that I'll leave you with. I don't think it's provocative, but it may be for many of you. And that is that when we talk about domestic, international violence, don't think that doing away with ISIL is going to end terrorism. Everybody thought if you could get rid of Al-Qaeda, that would do it. Killing bin Laden, they thought it was like killing Dracula, the phenomenon would leave. And then they said that, in fact, that Al-Qaeda had, and Al-Qaeda did have a dip, Al-Qaeda is now coming back. ISIL then succeeded. Until we, and this isn't the subject of my talk, but you can ask me in the Q&A, until we address the root causes for why this is going on, the conditions that exist in the region, the nature of the governments in the region, which are mostly authoritarian and repressive, does not make for happy campers, and the fact that the US and many of the European countries support those authoritarian regimes, provide the very weapons and the training that are used against their people, we're going to have this international problem. In the old days, it would have been done in the name of socialism, radical socialism, or if you will, radical Arab nationalism. Now it'll be done in the name of religion. Why? Because when you appeal to religion, it gives you a much more firm base. I lived during World War II. I was a young kid, but all the movies always had the chaplain saying, we're going to win because God's on our side. So when somebody's going in a battle, it's not enough that your president, who's just a human being, says, go and die for me. But if you say, we're going to win because we're on God's side, and if you have a belief, as President Reagan did, when so many of our Marines were killed in Lebanon, he said, we don't need to pray for them, we know they're in heaven. In other words, you know, when you die for a good cause and you die for other people and you're fighting on God's side, that's why extremists. If you go back to bin Laden's first big speech, you can look it up. He gave it on CNN. The whole first part was appealing to the grievances that many have in the region about their governments, about Palestine and Israel. And then the last part, when he then said, this is what we ought to do, then he began to appeal to religion and say, this is what God wants us to do. You know, but this is what all religious extremists do, to justify. Because what a religious extremist wants to be able to say is, remember, all religions say that they are compassionate. I mean, you don't get, religious extremists who blow up an abortion clinic don't say that Jesus wasn't compassionate and that Christianity isn't. Jews, Christians, and Muslims all say that the basic truth of their religion is love of God and love of neighbor. And yet the extremists who will say that they are part of their mainstream faith commit their acts. Why? Because they say these are unusual times. And in unusual times, in other words, when you're really under siege and threatened, then you're facing a horrific reality, then it's legitimate for you to act the other way. And the best way to legitimate it is to do it in the name of God. You know, not simply in the name of the leader. Okay? All right. But where are we then when we talk about Islamophobia today, and why is it significant? We need to put it into focus because Islamophobia in America is now at its worst place. On the other hand, there are some signs of change. Some people have gotten very upset that major politicians have said, don't let any Muslims in the country, or have said we shouldn't allow any Syrian refugees in, when in fact the Syrian refugees are victims, and they are victims of a very government that we say is terrible, and they are victims of a Western foreign policy that stayed back and watched the whole situation devolve. And so we do have some politicians stepping forward. And so you have somebody like Paul Ryan taking issue with, for example, somebody like Donald Trump on this. I mean, that can be a good sign. We have major media beginning to cover some of these stories. We have universities drafting statements. We have a project that we have called The Bridge. If you look it up on the internet, bridge.georgetown.edu. If you want information on Islamophobia, if you want information on the Muslim world, go to bridge.georgetown.edu. If you want information on what's going on historically today on a lot of these issues. If you're listening and saying, are there statistics to back up X or Y? Go on there, you'll find most of those statistics. Bridge.georgetown.edu. Now, we don't have it there, but you should feel free to take out that checkbook or to wire transfer. If you want to feel safest, I'll give you my personal wire transfer. And then I promise I will give that money over to the center. And in any case, okay. But why is it important to us? Our strength as a country, we pride ourselves on being a country that is new, a country that is multi-religious, multi-ethnic. You know, we don't have a long history. We don't have a long history of being a group of white people of the same ethnic group who speak the same language. And therefore, when suddenly we're faced with the browning, and this goes on in a number of countries like Sweden and Denmark, etc., people are basically saying, well, you can't be a Dane. Now, it's not to say that there aren't Danes that don't feel differently, but Germany, until a few years ago, you could be a second-generation Muslim, second generation, born in the country. You could never become a citizen. You could have a university education, etc. It was harder for them. We always prided ourselves. You know, you got the Statue of Liberty, you know, welcoming everybody to come. We believe in our democratic principles. We believe in our freedoms. If we make an exception of a group in America, we're doing exactly what we did to the Japanese. We're doing what we did in the old days to Native Americans. We're doing what was done to ethnic Catholics when they first came. And you had signs saying, no blacks, Jews, or Italians need apply, or some other ethnic group. And we run that risk. When, as I said, the data is, you've got this overwhelming number of Muslims who are part of the mosaic. And also, there's no overwhelming number of Muslims in the country. They're a very small percentage of the population. But it's ironic, you know. If I tell somebody that there are, whatever the numbers, 2.5 million, 6 million, first presumption, let me just ask you, is an honest thing. If I say to you there are 6 million Muslims, how many of you think, oh, 6 million Muslims, they must be religious? How many of you think they must be religious? Almost nobody raises their hand. This is incredible. You're either on drugs or you're very unique here and have an incredible program. I mean, stats show that most people think that, for example, most Muslims go to mosque regularly, that they pray regularly. There are many Muslims who do. There are lots of Muslims who do not, as exist in other groups. I'm not saying that that means that a good Muslim is somebody who doesn't go to mosque. I'm saying there's this kind of underlying presupposition. It's almost as if people forget that Muslims are like everybody else who may be believers. Their belief is important, but what's really important for them often is the education of their kids, their jobs, their safety, their security. Major polls show that while there are many in America that don't like, in the Muslim world that don't like American foreign policy, the vast majority of Muslims admire America for its education, its freedoms, its technology. Want the very same things and want it for themselves. And guess what? That's what Americans pride themselves on and say they're most proud of. And most people in the Muslim world have the same major concern that most Americans do: security. Why? Because 90% of those who suffer from extremist attacks are in the Muslim world. So you've got that issue, and you've got the issue here where we have a majority of the population that's totally integrated, and yet there's a disproportionate problem with profiling and civil liberties. In major cases. So it's our job, it seems to me, to be sure that America's strong. And that's why our elections are so important. For some of you who are older, you remember a time when people would vote, but they'd vote straight party. Or they'd vote or they wouldn't vote. You don't have a choice today, because people would just leave it up and figure everything will work out. In other words, you sort of roughly trust the person who's going to be your senator or member of the House. Might not be the best person in the world, but you didn't expect that it could lead to a tragedy. We live in a world now where at any point in time, somebody can say, let's go to war. Do you know what I mean? It's not a time when it's just like minor stuff. And we live in a time when if we go to war, there are tremendous economic, let alone the human situation, repercussions. Okay? Or if we provoke or feed terrorism, we've learned there are tremendous costs to that. So we as voters have to be concerned about our presidential elections, about our congressional elections. And we have to be concerned about how the next generation is educated. Thank you.